The auctioneer's voice cut through the frigid November air like a blade, and Mitchell Raines felt his jaw tighten as he watched the young woman stumble onto the raised platform, her threadbare dress doing nothing against the bitter wind that swept through Scottsbluff, Nebraska, that morning in 1884. She was shivering so violently that he could see it from where he stood at the back of the crowd, her arms wrapped around herself in a futile attempt to preserve warmth, her lips already taking on a bluish tint that made something fierce and protective roar to life in his chest. He had come to town to purchase supplies for the winter months ahead, not to attend a debt auction where desperate people sold whatever they had left to survive. But the commotion had drawn him in, curiosity getting the better of him until he saw her. She could not have been more than 22 or 23, with long dark hair that hung in tangled waves around her pale face, and eyes that held a mixture of terror and resignation that made his heart clench painfully. The auctioneer was listing her skills, reading from a crumpled piece of paper with all the enthusiasm of a man selling livestock, and Mitchell felt his hands curl into fists at his sides. Good with cooking, cleaning, mending, and general household tasks, the auctioneer droned on, his breath creating clouds in the cold air. Contract for 1 year of service to settle debts owed by her late father to various creditors in town, starting bid at $50. Mitchell watched as several men in the crowd began to call out numbers, their eyes roving over the shivering woman with an interest that made his blood boil. He recognized some of them, knew their reputations, and the thought of any of them taking her home made him move forward before he could think better of it. His voice rang out clear and strong above the others. $200. The crowd went silent, heads turning to stare at him. The auctioneer's eyebrows shot up nearly to his hairline, and the other bidders fell back, knowing they could not match such a sum. Mitchell kept his eyes on the woman, watching as she lifted her gaze to meet his for the first time. Her eyes were a deep green, like the pine trees that grew in the hills outside town, and in them he saw a flicker of something that might have been hope before she quickly looked away, as though afraid to believe in anything good. $200, the auctioneer repeated, his voice rising with excitement. Going once, going twice, sold to Mitchell Raines. Mitchell made his way through the crowd, pulling off his heavy sheepskin coat as he climbed the steps to the platform. The woman's shivering had intensified, her whole body trembling like a leaf in a storm, and without a word, he draped the coat around her shoulders. It swallowed her small frame, the hem falling past her knees, but he could see the immediate relief in her face as the warmth enveloped her. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible, hoarse from the cold. "Can you walk?" he asked gently, and she nodded, though he could see her legs were unsteady. He resisted the urge to simply pick her up and carry her, knowing that such a gesture might frighten her after what she had just endured. Instead, he offered his arm, and after a moment's hesitation, she took it, her fingers gripping him with surprising strength. The auctioneer thrust papers at him, demanding payment and signature, and Mitchell handled the transaction with efficient speed, wanting nothing more than to get this woman somewhere warm. He had left his horse tied outside the general store, and he guided her there slowly, matching his pace to her stumbling steps. She was wearing shoes that had more holes than leather, he realized with a surge of anger at whoever had let her come to such a state. "What is your name?" he asked as they walked, and she glanced up at him with those wary green eyes. "Clara Brennan," she said softly. "And you are Mitchell Raines." "Most folks call me Mitch," he told her, untying his horse's reins from the post. The big bay gelding nickered softly, and Mitch stroked his neck before turning back to Clara. "My ranch is about an hour's ride from here. I know you have been through an ordeal, but I need to get you there where it is warm. "Can you ride?" Clara looked at the horse with apprehension. "I have not ridden much," she admitted, and Mitch nodded, understanding. "Then you will ride with me," he said matter-of-factly, and before she could protest, he swung himself up into the saddle and reached down for her. She stared at his outstretched hand for a long moment, and he could see the war playing out across her face, the fear fighting with necessity. Finally, she reached up, and he grasped her hand firmly, pulling her up behind him with easy strength. She settled awkwardly on the horse's back, and he guided her arms around his waist. "Hold on tight," he instructed. "I will not let you fall." They rode out of Scottsbluff with Clara clinging to his back, her face pressed against his shoulder. Mitch could feel her shivering even through his thick shirt and vest, and he pushed the horse into a faster pace than he normally would have taken, wanting to get her to the warmth of his home as quickly as possible. The Nebraska landscape stretched out around them, rolling hills covered in brown grass and patches of snow, the sky a heavy gray that promised more cold weather to come. As they rode, Mitch's mind churned with questions he did not yet have the right to ask. What debts had her father left that would force her onto an auction block? Where was her family? How had she ended up alone and unprotected in a frontier town known for its rough ways? But he held his tongue, knowing that she needed warmth and safety before she needed his curiosity satisfied. The Raines Ranch came into view after what felt like an eternity, and Mitch felt Clara lift her head from his shoulder to look at it. He tried to see it through her eyes, the sturdy two-story house he had built with his own hands 5 years ago when he had first claimed this land, the barn and outbuildings that spoke of a prosperous operation, the fenced pastures where his cattle grazed. It was not grand, but it was solid and well-maintained, a good home for anyone who needed one. He rode straight up to the front porch and dismounted, reaching up to help Clara down. Her legs buckled when her feet hit the ground, and this time he did not hesitate, sweeping her up into his arms and carrying her toward the door. She made a small sound of protest, but he ignored it, kicking the door open and stepping into the blessed warmth of his home. The hearth dominated the main room, a massive stone fireplace that he had kept burning since the weather had turned cold in October, and he carried Clara straight to it, settling her in the large armchair that sat closest to the flames. She curled into it immediately, still wrapped in his coat, and he could see tears tracking down her cheeks though she made no sound. "Let me tend to my horse, and then I will make you something hot to drink," he said, and she nodded without speaking. Mitch left reluctantly, hurrying through the task of unsaddling and brushing down his gelding, making sure the animal had feed and water before he practically ran back to the house. Clara had not moved from the chair, and he could see she was still shivering, though less violently than before. He went to the kitchen area, stoking the stove and putting water on to boil, then rummaged in his cupboards for the tin of tea that his sister had given him last Christmas. He was not much of a tea drinker himself, preferring coffee, but he thought Clara might need something gentler. While the water heated, he went to his bedroom and pulled out the spare quilts he kept in the chest at the foot of his bed, carrying them back to drape over Clara's lap and shoulders. She looked up at him with those haunted green eyes, and he saw her throat work as she swallowed. "Why did you do it?" she asked, her voice still hoarse. "Why did you pay so much for a stranger's contract?" Mitch crouched down beside the chair so he could meet her eyes at the same level. "Because I saw you shivering up there, and I knew what some of those other men would have done with you," he said honestly. "And I could not let that happen. You are coming home to my warm hearth, Clara Brennan, and I give you my word that you will be safe here." Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks, and she looked away, her hands clutching at the quilts. "I do not know how to repay such kindness," she whispered. You do not need to repay anything, Mitch said firmly. The contract says a year of service, but I am not a man who holds with such things. You can stay as long as you need, work if you want to, and when you are ready to leave, you can go with my blessing and enough money to start fresh somewhere else. Clara turned back to him, her eyes wide with disbelief. You would do that? But the money you paid is mine to spend as I see fit, he interrupted gently. And I see fit to spend it making sure you are safe and cared for. Now, let me get you that tea, and then we can talk about practical matters like food and getting you some proper clothes. He returned to the kitchen and prepared the tea, adding honey to sweeten it, and brought it back to her in his most sturdy mug. She wrapped her hands around it gratefully, breathing in the steam before taking a careful sip. Color was beginning to return to her cheeks. He was pleased to see the blue tint fading from her lips. "When did you last eat?" he asked, and she frowned, thinking. "Yesterday morning," she said finally. There was not much food in the boarding house, and what there was, they said I could not have since I owed them money. Mitch felt that surge of anger again, but pushed it down. Getting angry would not help Clara now. Instead, he went back to the kitchen and began pulling out supplies for a meal. He was no great cook, but years of living alone had taught him the basics, and soon he had bacon sizzling in a pan and was mixing up batter for johnny cakes. He put on a fresh pot of coffee for himself and worked with efficient movements, aware of Clara watching him from her nest of quilts. "Tell me about yourself," he said as he worked, wanting to distract her from whatever dark thoughts might be circling in her mind. "Where are you from originally?" "Pennsylvania," Clara said after a moment. "My father was a merchant there, and we had a good life until my mother died of fever when I was 16. After that, my father started making poor business decisions, drinking too much, gambling. We lost everything over the course of 3 years, and he decided we should come west for a fresh start." She paused, taking another sip of tea. "We made it as far as Scottsbluff before he died. Heart gave out, the doctor said. I found out after he was buried that he had borrowed money from half the town, using my name on the notes. They said I had to honor the debts or go to jail." "That is not legal," Mitch said, flipping the johnny cakes with more force than necessary. "They cannot hold you responsible for debts you did not sign for." "Try telling that to Judge Harwood," Clara said with a bitter laugh. "He is friends with the creditors. He is the one who ordered the auction." Mitch filed that information away for later consideration. He knew Judge Harwood by reputation, a corrupt official who used his position to line his own pockets and those of his associates. But that was a problem for another day. Right now, Clara needed food and rest. He piled the bacon and johnny cakes onto a plate and brought it to her along with a fork and knife, watching as her eyes widened at the amount of food. "Eat as much as you can," he encouraged. "You need to get your strength back." Clara ate slowly at first, as though afraid the food might be taken away. But as she continued and nothing bad happened, she began to eat with more enthusiasm. Mitch made himself a plate and sat in the other chair by the fire, eating his own meal while trying not to stare at her too obviously. She was beautiful, he realized, even exhausted and dressed in rags. Her face had fine bones and a delicate structure, her skin pale but smooth, her dark hair holding hints of auburn in the firelight. But it was not her physical beauty that had compelled him to bid so high at the auction. It was something in her eyes, a strength that refused to be completely broken despite everything she had endured. She was a survivor, and he respected that. When she had finished eating, Clara set the plate aside and pulled the quilts more tightly around herself. "I do not know what to say," she admitted. "This morning I thought my life was over, that I would end up in some terrible situation with no way out. And now I am here, warm and fed with a man who seems determined to be kind for no reason I can understand. Maybe I just do not like seeing people suffer when I can do something about it, Mitch said with a shrug. Or maybe I am tired of living alone in this big house and could use some company. Does the reason matter so much? Clara studied him for a long moment. I suppose not, she said finally. But I want you to know that I will work hard to earn my keep. I meant what I said before. I am good at cooking and cleaning and mending. I can help with the ranch work too if you need it. I am stronger than I look. I do not doubt it, Mitch said with a small smile. But for now, I think what you need most is rest. Let me show you to the spare bedroom upstairs. It has a good bed and plenty of blankets, and you can sleep as long as you need. He led her up the stairs, carrying a lamp to light the way, and opened the door to the bedroom he kept for guests. It was not large, but it was clean and comfortable, with a sturdy bed frame and a thick mattress, a washstand with a pitcher and basin, and a small dresser for clothes. Clara looked around with something like wonder on her face. I have not had a room to myself since we left Pennsylvania, she said softly, reaching out to touch the quilt that covered the bed. Thank you, Mitch, for everything. You are welcome, he said, setting the lamp on the dresser. There is a lock on the door if that makes you feel safer. I will not be offended if you use it. And if you need anything in the night, anything at all, my room is just across the hall. Do not hesitate to wake me. Clara nodded, and he left her there, closing the door behind him and listening until he heard the quiet snick of the lock engaging. He did not blame her for that caution. She had no reason to trust him yet, no matter how kind he tried to be. Trust would have to be earned over time. Mitch went back downstairs and cleaned up the kitchen, then spent some time catching up on chores he had neglected during his trip to town. The ranch ran fairly smoothly with just him managing it, since he kept his herd small enough to handle alone, but there were always tasks that needed doing. He repaired a broken fence post, checked on his chickens, and split more wood for the fire, trying to work off the restless energy that hummed through his body. He could not stop thinking about Clara, about the fear in her eyes when she had stood on that auction block, the way she had trembled against him during the ride home. He wanted to hunt down every person who had failed to protect her, who had put her in that position, and make them pay for their cruelty. But violence would not help her now. What she needed was safety, stability, and time to heal from whatever traumas she had endured. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Mitch went back inside and stoked the fire, making sure it would burn through the night. He made himself a simple supper of leftover bacon and bread, not feeling particularly hungry, and sat by the fire with a book he had been trying to finish for the past month. But the words kept blurring together, his mind wandering upstairs to where Clara was hopefully sleeping soundly. Darkness fell, and Mitch finally gave up on reading, banking the fire and heading upstairs to his own room. He paused outside Clara's door, listening, but heard nothing. Good. She needed rest more than anything else right now. He went to bed in his own room, leaving his door slightly ajar in case she called out in the night, and tried to sleep. The next morning, Mitch woke early as always, the winter sun just beginning to brighten the sky. He dressed quickly and went downstairs to start the fire and put on coffee, moving quietly so as not to disturb Clara. But when he came back from the barn after completing his morning chores, he found her in the kitchen, wearing the same threadbare dress from yesterday but with her hair neatly braided down her back, stirring something in a pot on the stove. "You should be resting," he said, and she turned to him with a determined expression. "I have rested enough," she said firmly. "And I told you I would earn my keep. I found oatmeal in your cupboard and thought to make breakfast. I hope that is all right." Mitch wanted to argue, but something in her face stopped him. She needed to feel useful, he realized. needed to feel like she had some control over her situation after having it all stripped away. So, instead of protesting, he simply nodded and poured himself a cup of coffee. "That sounds good," he said. "Thank you." They ate breakfast together in companionable silence, and Mitch could see that Clara was moving a bit more easily this morning, the warmth and food and sleep having done their work. When they had finished, she began clearing the dishes without being asked, and he let her, instead heading back outside to continue his work. The pattern repeated over the next several days. Clara took over the household tasks with quiet efficiency, cooking meals that were far better than anything Mitch had managed on his own, keeping the house clean and orderly, mending his clothes and linens with neat, careful stitches. She rarely spoke unless spoken to, but Mitch noticed that some of the haunted look was beginning to fade from her eyes, replaced by a cautious contentment. He made a trip to town after the first week, taking careful note of Clara's size before he went. At the general store, he purchased several lengths of sturdy fabric, along with needles and thread, and some ready-made items like a warm coat, proper boots, and undergarments. The store owner, Mrs. Henderson, gave him a knowing look but did not comment, simply wrapped his purchases and took his money. When he got home and presented the items to Clara, she burst into tears, pressing her hands to her face. Mitch stood there awkwardly, unsure of what to do, until she finally looked up at him with red-rimmed eyes. "No one has ever been this kind to me," she said, her voice breaking. "Not even my own father toward the end. I do not understand why you are doing this." Mitch set the packages down and took her hands gently in his, looking into her eyes. "Maybe you do not need to understand it," he said quietly. "Maybe you just need to accept it and let yourself be cared for. Is that so hard?" "Yes," she admitted with a watery laugh. "I have spent the last 2 years learning not to trust anyone, not to expect help from any quarter. It is hard to unlearn that." "Then take your time," Mitch said, releasing her hands. "I am not going anywhere." Over the following weeks, as November turned to December, and the first real snows began to fall, Mitch watched Clara slowly begin to relax into life at the ranch. She made herself dresses from the fabric he had brought, her skill with a needle evident in the neat seams and careful details. She wore the coat and boots constantly, reveling in the warmth, and he often caught her smiling to herself as she went about her work. They began talking more, sharing stories from their pasts during meals and evenings by the fire. Mitch learned that Clara had once dreamed of being a teacher, that she loved to read but had not owned a book in years, that she had a sweet tooth for peppermints, and could play the piano though she had not touched one since leaving Pennsylvania. She learned that he was 27, had come to Nebraska from Texas after his parents died, that he had a younger sister named Sarah who lived in Cheyenne with her husband and 2 children, and that he had built his ranch from nothing through years of hard work and careful planning. As Christmas approached, Mitch found himself looking forward to coming inside each evening, knowing Clara would be there with a warm meal and a soft smile. He caught himself watching her more than he should, noticing the way firelight played across her face, the graceful movements of her hands as she sewed, the sound of her humming while she cooked. He was falling for her, he realized with a start one evening as she laughed at something he said. Falling hard and fast, and he did not know what to do about it. The contract said she owed him a year of service, but he had meant what he told her that first day. She was free to leave whenever she wished. But the thought of her leaving, of this house being empty and silent again, made his chest ache in a way he had not experienced before. He had been alone for 5 years, and he had thought he was content with that solitude. But Clara had shown him what he had been missing, and now he could not imagine going back. 2 weeks before Christmas, a heavy snowstorm rolled in, dumping nearly 2 feet of snow across the ranch and making it impossible to go anywhere. Mitch spent most of his time ensuring the animals were cared for, and the paths between buildings were clear, coming inside exhausted and half frozen each evening. Clara always had hot food waiting and would insist on him sitting by the fire while she brought him coffee and helped him out of his snow-crusted coat and boots. One evening, after a particularly brutal day fighting the elements, Mitch came inside to find Clara at the stove, but this time she was making something he did not recognize. The scent was sweet and spicy, and he inhaled deeply. "What is that?" he asked, and Clara turned with a secretive smile. "Gingerbread," she said. "My mother used to make it every Christmas, and I found molasses and ginger in your supplies. I hope you do not mind that I use them." "Mind? It smells like heaven," Mitch said, coming to stand beside her and peer into the pan. "I have not had gingerbread since I was a boy." "Then you will have some tonight," Clara said, shooing him away from the stove. "But first you need to eat real food. Go sit down." Mitch obeyed, settling into his chair with a contented sigh. This, he thought, this was what a home should feel like. Warm and welcoming, filled with good smells and soft laughter, with someone who cared waiting at the end of a hard day. He did not just want Clara to stay the year. He wanted her to stay forever. After they ate, Clara cut generous squares of gingerbread and brought them to the fireside, pouring fresh coffee for them both. They ate in comfortable silence, the wind howling outside but unable to penetrate the solid walls of the house. When Mitch finished his second piece, he set his plate aside and looked at Clara, who was gazing into the fire with a thoughtful expression. "What are you thinking about?" he asked gently, and she turned to him with a slight blush. "I was thinking that I never imagined I could feel this content again," she admitted. "These past weeks with you have been the happiest I have been in years, and I keep waiting for something to go wrong, for the other shoe to drop, but it does not happen. You just keep being kind and patient and giving, and I do not know how to handle it." Mitch leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Clara, I need to tell you something, and I want you to listen without interrupting. Can you do that?" She nodded, her green eyes wide and fixed on his face. "I did not plan for this to happen," he began slowly. "When I brought you home, I truly did just want to help someone who needed it. But over these past weeks, you have become so much more than a person I helped. You have become a friend, a companion, someone I look forward to seeing every day. And somewhere along the way, I have come to care for you in a way that goes beyond friendship." Clara's breath caught, but she did not speak, honoring his request to let him finish. "I know it might be too soon," Mitch continued. "I know you might not feel the same way, and that is all right. I will never pressure you or make you feel obligated because of the contract or what I paid for it. But I need you to know that if you wanted to stay here, not as a servant but as something more, I would welcome it with my whole heart. I would court you properly, give you time to be sure, and if you ever decided it was not what you wanted, you could still leave with my blessing. But I had to tell you how I feel, because keeping it inside was eating me alive." There was a long silence, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the wind outside. Clara stared at him, her expression unreadable, and Mitch felt his heart hammering in his chest. He had laid himself bare, and now all he could do was wait. Finally, Clara spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I thought I was imagining it," she said. "The way you looked at me sometimes, the extra kindnesses that went beyond what anyone would do for a stranger. I told myself I was being foolish, that you were just a good man, and I was reading too much into it because I wanted it to be true." "Wanted it to be true?" Mitch repeated, hope flaring in his chest. Clara nodded, tears beginning to slip down her cheeks. I have been falling in love with you since that first day when you wrapped your coat around me and promised I would be safe. Every kind word, every gentle gesture, every evening spent talking by the fire has made me love you more. But I was so afraid to hope, afraid that if I let myself believe in happiness again, it would be torn away. Mitch moved from his chair to kneel in front of her, taking her hands in his. I cannot promise that life will always be easy, he said seriously. But I can promise that I will never willingly hurt you, that I will protect you with everything I have, and that I will love you for as long as you will let me. Is that enough? Yes, Clara breathed, and then she was leaning forward, her forehead resting against his. Yes, Mitch. It is more than enough. He cupped her face gently in his hands and kissed her, soft and sweet, feeling her melt against him with a sigh. It was like coming home after a long journey, like finding something he had not known he was missing. When they finally pulled apart, both were smiling, and Clara let out a laugh that was half sob. I never thought I would be happy again, she said, reaching up to touch his face. And now I am so happy I do not know what to do with it. Then let us figure it out together, Mitch said, pulling her up and into his arms, holding her close while the fire warmed them, and the storm raged harmlessly outside. The days following their declaration were filled with a new kind of joy. Mitch courted Clara properly, as he had promised, taking time to woo her, despite the fact that they were already living under the same roof. He brought her wildflowers when he could find them under the snow, carved her a beautiful box for her sewing supplies, and spent every evening talking with her and learning everything there was to know about the woman he loved. Clara bloomed under the attention, her smiles coming more freely, her laughter ringing through the house. She began to talk about the future with tentative hope, asking about the ranch operations and offering suggestions, making plans for a garden in the spring. Mitch loved seeing her like this, confident and engaged, so different from the terrified woman who had shivered on the auction block. Christmas arrived, and they celebrated together with a feast Clara prepared, exchanging simple gifts. Mitch gave her a set of books he had ordered from a catalog, novels and poetry she had mentioned wanting to read. Clara gave him a shirt she had sewn, the stitching so fine it looked like something from a fancy store, and a pair of knitted socks that proved to be the warmest things he had ever worn. As they sat by the fire that evening, Clara curled against Mitch's side with his arm around her. He felt a contentment so complete it was almost frightening. This was everything he had ever wanted, even when he had not known to want it. I have been thinking, Clara said softly, tracing patterns on his chest with one finger. About us and the future. Oh, Mitch prompted, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. That contract says I owe you a year of service, she continued. It will be up in November. And I was thinking that perhaps, when it ends, we could have a different sort of contract, one that lasts a lifetime. Mitch pulled back enough to look down at her, his heart racing. Are you saying what I think you are saying? Clara looked up at him with those beautiful green eyes, now sparkling with happiness instead of fear. I am saying that I love you, Mitchell Raines, and I want to be your wife, if you will have me. If I will have you, Mitch repeated incredulously, then laughed and pulled her into a fierce kiss. When he broke away, he was grinning so wide his face hurt. Clara Brennan, I will marry you tomorrow if you are willing. I do not need to wait until November. Well, perhaps not tomorrow, Clara said with a laugh. I would like a little time to make a proper dress, and perhaps wait until spring when travel is easier so your sister could come. But soon, Mitch. I do not want to wait too long. Spring it is, Mitch agreed, already mentally planning everything that would need to be done. We can marry in the church in Scottsbluff, have a celebration afterward. I want everyone to know you are mine and I am yours. They spent the rest of the winter making plans and growing closer. Mitch taught Clara to ride properly, patient with her nervousness until she could handle a horse with confidence. Clara taught Mitch to appreciate music again, singing while she worked and convincing him to take her to the occasional dance in town when the weather permitted. They moved through the rhythms of ranch life together, partners in every way that mattered. In February, Mitch received a letter from his sister Sarah, responding to his news about the upcoming wedding with excitement and promising to come in late April with her family. Clara was nervous about meeting Mitch's only living relative, but he assured her that Sarah would love her immediately. As winter gave way to spring, and the snow began to melt, revealing the brown earth beneath, Mitch and Clara worked together to prepare for the wedding. Clara sewed herself a dress of soft blue fabric that Mitch had bought for her, creating something beautiful despite the simple design. Mitch cleaned and painted the house, fixed everything that needed repair, and made sure the ranch looked its best. Sarah arrived in late April with her husband James and their 2 children, and just as Mitch had predicted, she took to Clara immediately. The 2 women spent hours talking and laughing together, and Sarah insisted on helping with the final wedding preparations. She also took Mitch aside one evening and told him, with tears in her eyes, that she was so happy he had found someone to love, that she had worried about him being alone for so long. The wedding took place on the first Saturday in May, in the small church in Scottsbluff with half the town in attendance. Clara walked down the aisle on Sarah's husband's arm, since she had no family of her own to give her away, and Mitch felt his breath catch when he saw her. She was radiant, her dark hair crowned with wildflowers, her face glowing with happiness, and when she reached him and took his hands, he knew he was the luckiest man alive. They spoke their vows in clear, strong voices, promising to love and cherish each other through whatever life brought them. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, and told Mitch he could kiss his bride, the entire congregation erupted in applause and cheers. Mitch pulled Clara into his arms and kissed her thoroughly, not caring who was watching, and she kissed him back with equal enthusiasm. The celebration afterward was held at the ranch, with tables set up outside in the yard and food and drink enough for everyone. People danced and laughed and toasted the newlyweds, and several of the older women pulled Clara aside to welcome her properly to the community. Even Judge Harwood showed up, though Mitch noticed Clara stiffened when she saw him. The judge made a point of congratulating them, his smile not quite reaching his eyes, and Mitch made sure to keep himself between Clara and the man at all times. As the sun set and guests began to depart, Mitch and Clara stood together on the porch, waving goodbye. Sarah was staying another week to help Clara get settled as a married woman, though Mitch privately thought his wife needed no help. She had been running his household perfectly for months. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, Mitch carried Clara across the threshold of their bedroom, the one that had been his alone for so long and was now theirs together. He set her down gently and helped her out of the beautiful blue dress, his hands trembling slightly with the enormousness of the moment. Clara reached up and touched his face, her expression tender. "Thank you," she whispered, "for saving me, for loving me, for giving me a home and a future I never thought I would have." "Thank you for saying yes," Mitch replied, pulling her close. "For taking a chance on a cowboy who did not know what he was missing, until he saw you shivering at that auction and knew he had to bring you home to his warm hearth." They came together with a passion and tenderness that left them both breathless, discovering each other in the privacy of their marriage bed, creating new memories to replace the old hurts. And afterward, as they lay tangled together with moonlight streaming through the window, Clara pressed her hand over her heart and smiled. "I am home," she said simply. "Finally, truly home. And I am never letting you go, Mitch promised, sealing it with a kiss. The first year of their marriage passed in a blur of happiness and hard work. Clara threw herself into improving the ranch, planting an extensive garden that would provide vegetables for much of the year, raising chickens for eggs and meat, and even suggesting they expand the cattle operation. Mitch listened to her ideas and implemented many of them, impressed by her sharp mind and business sense. In the fall, Clara began to feel ill in the mornings, and it did not take long for them to realize she was pregnant. Mitch was over the moon with joy, already planning how he would expand the house to add more bedrooms for the children he hoped they would have. Clara was nervous but excited, writing to Sarah for advice and spending her evenings knitting tiny clothes. Their son was born the following spring, a healthy boy with his mother's green eyes and his father's strong features. They named him Thomas, after Mitch's father, and from the moment Mitch held his son for the first time, he felt his heart expand with a love he had not known was possible. Clara was a natural mother, patient and loving, and watching her with their child made Mitch fall in love with her all over again. As Thomas grew from a baby to a toddler, Clara became pregnant again, this time with twin girls they named Emma and Grace. The house was suddenly full of noise and chaos and laughter, and Mitch could not have been happier. He expanded the ranch operations with Clara's help, hiring a few ranch hands to help with the growing herd, and built additions onto the house to accommodate their expanding family. Life was not always easy. There were hard winters and dry summers, cattle that got sick and crops that failed, disagreements and moments of frustration. But through it all, Mitch and Clara faced everything together, their love growing deeper and stronger with each passing year. On their 5th anniversary, Mitch took Clara on a picnic to a spot overlooking the ranch, just the two of them while Sarah watched the children. They sat on a blanket and looked out over the land they had built together, the house and barns and fenced pastures, and Mitch pulled Clara close. "Do you remember that day at the auction?" he asked, and Clara nodded against his shoulder. "I remember thinking my life was over," she said quietly. "I was so cold and so scared, and I could not see any way forward that did not end in misery. And then I saw you shivering up there," Mitch continued, "and something in me just knew I could not walk away. I had to help you, had to make sure you were safe." "You did more than make me safe," Clara said, lifting her head to look at him. "You gave me a life beyond anything I had ever dreamed. A home, a family, a love that fills me up so completely I sometimes cannot believe it is real." "It is real," Mitch assured her, kissing her softly. "And it is forever. You and me, Clara, until the end of our days." "Until the end of our days," Clara agreed. And they sat there together watching the sun set over their land, surrounded by the life they had built from nothing but kindness and hope and love. The years continued to pass, marked by the growth of their children and the prosperity of their ranch. Thomas grew into a responsible young man who loved working with the cattle, while Emma and Grace were inseparable, often getting into mischief together, but always with such innocent joy that it was hard to be angry with them. When Thomas was 10, Clara gave birth to another son whom they named Jacob. And 2 years after that, their youngest child arrived, a daughter they called Rose. The house was perpetually full of noise and activity, with children running in and out, friends coming to visit, and the ranch hands stopping by for meals and conversation. Mitch often found himself pausing in his work to simply marvel at how his life had turned out. From a lonely cowboy living by himself to a man with a wife he adored and 5 children who brought him endless joy, it seemed almost impossible. But Clara always reminded him that it had all started with a simple choice to be kind, to see someone suffering and decide to do something about it. They made a point of teaching their children about compassion and justice, about standing up for those who could not stand up for themselves. Clara, in particular, became known in the community as someone who would help anyone in need, and their home often sheltered people who were struggling until they could get back on their feet. It was her way of paying forward the kindness that had saved her life. Judge Harwood eventually left Scottsbluff under a cloud of scandal, his corruption finally exposed, and Clara felt a fierce satisfaction at seeing justice done. But she did not dwell on the past, choosing instead to focus on the beautiful present and future she had with Mitch. As their children grew older and began to make their own ways in the world, Mitch and Clara found themselves with more time alone together. Thomas took over much of the ranch management, freeing Mitch to spend lazy afternoons with his wife, riding out to their favorite spots, or simply sitting on the porch together watching the sunset. On their 25th anniversary, their children threw them a big celebration, inviting friends and neighbors from miles around. There were speeches and toasts, and Emma read a poem she had written about her parents' love story. When it was over and everyone had gone home, Mitch and Clara sat by the fire in the same chairs they had occupied on that first day, though the chairs had been replaced several times over the years. 25 years, Clara mused, reaching over to take Mitch's hand. It seems like both a lifetime and no time at all. I would live it all again, Mitch said, squeezing her fingers. Every moment, every challenge, every joy, all of it as long as I had you by my side. You will always have me, Clara promised, in this life and whatever comes after. You are my heart, Mitch. You saved me in every way a person can be saved. And you saved me right back, Mitch said, pulling her into his lap despite their age, making her laugh. You took a lonely cowboy and showed him what it meant to truly live, to love, to build something meaningful. I am who I am because of you. They sat there together, two people who had found each other against all odds, whose love had weathered every storm and grown stronger with each passing year. Outside, the Nebraska wind howled across the plains, but inside, warmed by the fire and each other, they were exactly where they belonged. As the years continued to advance, Mitch and Clara became grandparents, welcoming Thomas's children first, then Emma's, and eventually Grace's. The ranch house that had once seemed too large for one man was now often bursting at the seams with family gatherings, and neither Mitch nor Clara would have had it any other way. They aged gracefully together, Mitch's dark hair turning silver and Clara's gaining threads of white that she refused to dye. They moved a bit slower, but their love remained as passionate and devoted as it had been in those early days. They still held hands when they walked, still kissed each other goodbye and hello, still talked for hours by the fire. On their 40th anniversary, with their children and grandchildren gathered around them, Mitch stood to make a speech. His voice was still strong despite his years, and everyone quieted to listen. 40 years ago, he began, I went to town to buy supplies and came home with something far more valuable. I saw a young woman shivering on an auction block, and I knew I could not leave her there. I told myself I was just being kind, just helping someone in need. But the truth is, from that very first moment, my heart recognized hers. I brought her home to my warm hearth, and she brought warmth to my heart. Everything good in my life has flowed from that decision, from that moment of connection. So I want to thank my wife, Clara, for saying yes to a future with me, for building this family and this life, for loving me even when I did not deserve it. Clara stood and went to him, tears streaming down her face, and the room erupted in applause. Their children and grandchildren surrounded them, and in that moment, Mitch felt complete. This was what life was about, he thought. Not just surviving, but thriving. Not just existing, but loving deeply and fully. Years later, when Mitch was in his 70s and Clara in her late 60s, they sat together on the porch one summer evening, watching their great-grandchildren play in the yard. Thomas had taken over the ranch entirely now, running it with the same dedication his father had shown, and Mitch and Clara were content to simply enjoy their golden years together. "You have any regrets?" Clara asked suddenly, and Mitch turned to look at her in surprise. "Not a single one," he said honestly. "Why do you ask?" "I was just thinking about how different my life could have been," Clara said thoughtfully. "If you had not been at that auction, if you had not bid on me, if you had not been the kind of man you are, I might have ended up in a terrible situation, or dead, or living a half-life somewhere with no joy or hope. Instead, I got this. I got you and our children and this beautiful life we built. It seems almost too good to be true." "It is true," Mitch said firmly, taking her hand. "It is real, and it is ours, and it has been the greatest adventure of my life. I love you, Clara Rains. I have loved you since that first day, and I will love you until my last breath and beyond." "And I love you," Clara said, leaning her head on his shoulder. "My cowboy, my rescuer, my partner, my love. Thank you for seeing me when I needed to be seen, for choosing me when I thought I had no choices left." They sat there together as the sun set, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink and purple, their hands intertwined, their hearts beating in sync. Around them, the ranch hummed with life, the legacy they had built together, and they knew that whatever time they had left would be spent exactly like this, together and grateful for every moment. When Mitch passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 78, with Clara holding his hand, she grieved deeply, but without regret. They had lived a full life together, loved completely and been loved in return, and raised a family that would carry on their values and their story. She buried him on a hill overlooking the ranch, with a simple headstone that read, "Mitchell Rains, beloved husband, father, and friend." Clara lived for another 5 years after Mitch's death, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, sharing stories of the man who had saved her and loved her so completely. When she finally passed, also peacefully and surrounded by love, they buried her next to Mitch, and the entire community turned out to pay their respects to the woman who had become a pillar of their town. On her headstone, Thomas had inscribed the words, "Clara Rains, beloved wife, mother, and friend. She came home to his warm hearth, and she warmed all our hearts in return." Years later, when Thomas's own grandchildren asked about the story of how their great-grandparents met, he would tell them about the auction, about the shivering woman and the cowboy who could not walk away, about how one moment of compassion had changed the course of so many lives. And the children would listen with wide eyes, learning that love could be found in the most unexpected places, that kindness was never wasted, and that the choices we make to help others often end up helping ourselves in ways we never imagined. The ranch continued to thrive, passed down through generations, and somewhere in the main house, the descendants of Mitch and Clara kept the original contract from that long-ago auction, yellowed with age but carefully preserved. Not as a reminder of servitude or debt, but as a symbol of how something meant to be a burden had transformed into the greatest blessing of their ancestors' lives. And on cold winter evenings, when the wind howled across the Nebraska plains and families gathered around warm hearths, the story of Mitch and Clara would be told again, a reminder that love could conquer fear, that kindness could change destinies, and that sometimes the most important thing a person could do was simply see someone who needed help and decide to act. The legacy of that November day in 1884, when a cowboy saw a woman shivering at an auction and said, "She's coming home to my warm hearth," lived on through all the generations that followed, a testament to the enduring power of love, compassion, and the simple human act of caring for another soul in need. And though Mitch and Clara had long since left this world, the warmth they had created together continued to burn bright, a fire that would never go out, passed down through their family like the most precious inheritance of all.